Chapter 490. Razeal finally reappeared on top of the kingdom wall with Sofia beside him, both of them landing gently on the stone as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The sound of their feet touching the wall immediately drew everyone's attention. The three lords, the Queen, Maria, and Nancy all turned toward them at once. Yet none of them spoke. They simply stood there, staring. The silence itself felt strange. It wasn't because they were calm, but because their minds had completely stopped working. If someone had looked closely, they would have noticed their slightly widened eyes, their stiff shoulders, and expressions that looked as though they had forgotten how to breathe for a moment. It wasn't simple shock anymore. They had gone far beyond that. They were completely flabbergasted. Just a little while ago, they had watched Razeal kill a Supreme. Even that alone was enough to shake everything they knew about the world. A Supreme wasn't someone ordinary people even dreamed of defeating. They were monsters standing at the absolute peak of the continents. Yet this 16-year-old boy had cut one down before their eyes. Somehow, they had still managed to force themselves to remain calm after that. The three lords and the queen had begun accepting reality. They had even started discussing accepting him as their new king. Their minds had barely managed to keep up with that impossible event, but then two more impossible existences had appeared. The Empress, the matriarch of the Virulent family. The moment those two women appeared, every bit of calm they had painfully gathered shattered all over again. It felt as though someone had poured ice into their veins. Even breathing had become difficult. Every single one of them knew exactly who those women were. Even if they didn't know every detail, everyone knew enough. One was called the strongest person alive, the God Abductor, known by many crazy titles and nicknames. The other was feared across the world as the Kinslayer, the woman people literally called the problem. Just hearing their names was enough to make kingdoms think twice before even considering a move. And both of them had appeared directly in front of Razeal. Not beside him, not behind him, in front of him. That alone was enough to make everyone's hearts sink. From the rumors, they could guess the relationship between Razeal and those two women was definitely not good. It was complicated, maybe even terrible, but certainly not positive based on what little they knew. For Nancy and Maria, who knew a little more than the others, it looked even worse. While the others worried those two hated Razeal and would create problems now, Maria and Nancy knew it was not one-sided at all. They were more worried that Razeal himself was going to provoke them. They knew Razeal didn't simply dislike them. He hated them, and those women carried emotions just as complicated toward him. For a moment, both women genuinely believed the situation was about to explode into another disaster. How could it not? Even an idiot could guess as much. Fortunately, that never happened. Even though none of them had dared to move close enough to overhear the conversation, they had watched everything from a distance. They had seen the expressions. They had seen the atmosphere change several times. They had watched killing intent rise and disappear. They had watched people leave alive. That alone was enough. Somehow, against all expectations, the conversation seemed to have ended peacefully. Or at least, peacefully enough. That realization quietly allowed everyone to breathe again. Now, with Razeal and Sofia standing before them once more, nobody knew what to say. The silence stretched on. No one greeted them. No one congratulated them. No one questioned them. They simply stared. Razeal looked from one face to another before a small frown appeared on his forehead. What? His question broke the silence. The three lords looked at one another. The queen looked away awkwardly. Even Nancy coughed lightly. Nothing, one of the lords hurriedly said, shaking his head. Nothing at all. The other two quickly nodded as well, and the queen forced a smile. The truth was that none of them knew how they were supposed to address Razeal anymore. My lord, your majesty, king. Every title felt strange. Only a short time ago, he had been a complete outsider. Now he had practically saved their kingdom, killed the enemy supreme, and protected everyone. By every agreement they had made, he was now supposed to become their king. Yet saying those words aloud still felt unbelievably awkward. Calling someone who wasn't even born in their kingdom your majesty after only a few hours was something none of them were mentally prepared for, not after everything that had happened today. Meanwhile, Maria wasn't paying attention to any of that. Her narrowed eyes remained completely fixed on Sofia. There wasn't even an attempt to hide the displeasure on her face, or rather, the hatred. Pure hatred. Sofia noticed immediately. The corners of her lips slowly curled upward into a smug grin. She knew exactly why Maria was glaring at her, and honestly, she found it hilarious. Without saying a single word, Sofia slowly licked her lips. She did it deliberately, as though she were tasting something sweet she had enjoyed only moments earlier. The gesture lasted barely a second, but it was more than enough. Maria's face instantly darkened. The veins near her temple almost twitched. Her fists clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. For one terrifying second, she genuinely wanted to punch that smug smile right off Sofia's face. She barely stopped herself, her entire body trembling from holding back. She couldn't even speak. Instead, she screamed inside her own head, calling her a bitch. Sofia saw every reaction, every tiny twitch, every clenching fist, every ounce of jealousy. Her grin only became wider. She looked completely satisfied with herself, almost proud, like a victorious cat teasing another after stealing its favorite toy. Nancy remained completely silent throughout everything. Unlike Maria, she didn't let her emotions show on her face. She simply stood there looking at Razeal as though she had just witnessed a ghost walk back from the dead. The more she looked at him, the harder it became to understand what kind of person he actually was. A boy just 2 years older than her had defeated a supreme. A boy who had stood face to face against the strongest people in the world without lowering his head even once. Someone who could somehow make the Empress herself step back. It was simply beyond reason. She wasn't even sure whether what she was feeling right now was amazement, admiration, disbelief, or fear. Perhaps it was all of them together. Every few seconds she found herself looking at him again, almost unconsciously, as though trying to convince herself that he was actually standing there, and not just something her mind had imagined. She wanted to ask countless questions, yet not a single one managed to leave her mouth. Razeal looked around at everyone's unusually quiet faces before simply shrugging. He honestly didn't care much about their reactions. Whether they were shocked, amazed, terrified, or confused made very little difference to him. He had long stopped expecting people to react normally around him. "All right," he finally said in his usual calm voice, while glancing toward the city behind the massive defensive wall. "Let's head back and see how much damage was done." Hearing his words finally broke everyone's thoughts. The three lords, the Queen, Nancy, Maria, and Sofia all silently nodded before preparing to move. Just then, Razeal slowly raised one hand. Instantly, the enormous wall of dark ash surrounding the battlefield began trembling. The gigantic fortifications, towers, barriers, and countless defensive structures he had created started breaking apart into black particles. Like smoke flowing backward, they slowly dissolved into the ground beneath them. Even the thick defensive pillars that had looked indestructible only moments ago quietly disappeared as though they had never existed in the first place. Within less than a minute, everything was gone, and the entire battlefield became open once again. They slowly landed on the ground as the giant wall standing under their feet disappeared. Everyone still quietly watched the unbelievable sight unfold. It wasn't just the power required to create such massive structures that amazed them, it was the control. The fact that he could dismiss every single piece so effortlessly was just as unbelievable. Normally, large-scale elemental magic left traces behind, or required enormous effort to undo, yet Razeal simply erased everything with a casual wave of his hand. It looked so natural that it almost felt like breathing to him. Nobody questioned it aloud, though many thoughts crossed their minds. The Queen quietly glanced toward the empty battlefield, where the wall had stood only moments earlier. She couldn't help feeling a tiny sense of loss. Those defenses had looked almost impossible to break, and could have protected Silver City for years. Yet at the same time, there was no longer any need for them. The war had ended. Keeping such gigantic black walls surrounding the city would only become an eyesore. Besides, none of them felt comfortable asking Razeal to keep maintaining something like that forever. Without another word, everyone followed behind him. After crossing the former defensive line, they finally jumped down onto the other side of Silver City's massive outer wall. The moment their feet landed, almost everyone stopped except Razeal. The scene before them was completely different from what they had expected. The city had undoubtedly suffered damage. There was no denying that. Numerous buildings had partially collapsed under the earlier aerial bombardment. Entire rooftops had been blown away. Massive stone debris covered several streets, and giant craters were scattered throughout the city roads where attacks had struck directly. Broken walls, shattered windows, cracked towers, and piles of rubble could be seen everywhere. The destruction was obvious. Yet, something was terribly unusual. There was almost no chaos. No crowds running around in panic. No screaming children. No people fighting over supplies. And no citizens desperately trying to flee. Instead, the city was strangely calm. Almost unbelievably so. People sat quietly along the sides of the streets in organized groups. Parents hugged frightened children close to their chests, while softly comforting them. Elderly people rested against walls as younger family members stayed beside them. Friends quietly whispered to each other, trying to reassure one another that everything was over. The fear was still visible on many faces. Some children still cried quietly, and some adults stared blankly into space, still unable to process what had happened. But despite all that, nobody was panicking or causing trouble. It was almost as though someone had somehow organized the entire city within only a few minutes. Everywhere they looked, groups of hundreds of civilians sat together in orderly sections. And standing beside every large gathering were soldiers. 2B4 unit soldiers guarded every single group. They stood perfectly straight, without moving unnecessarily. Their expressions never changed, and their eyes calmly swept across the surroundings with professional precision. Unlike before, each of them now carried sleek, futuristic rifles instead of their standard weapons. The strange firearms rested firmly in their hands as they quietly watched over both the civilians and the surrounding streets. They weren't threatening anyone, nor were they shouting orders. They were simply present, watching, protecting, and maintaining order. The discipline was almost frightening. It was as though everyone had naturally accepted their instructions. The atmosphere wasn't peaceful, but it was controlled, perfectly controlled. The Queen slowly blinked several times, unable to fully understand what she was seeing. Lord Arvin quietly frowned. Both of the other lords looked around in complete disbelief as well. Even Nancy found herself scanning every street twice, wondering if she had somehow missed the chaos. Maria looked just as confused. This wasn't how cities reacted after disasters. They all knew that, having experienced emergencies before. Normally, after something like this, the streets would be filled with terrified civilians running in every direction. Families would become separated, rumors would spread faster than fire, shops would be looted, and people would scream. Panic alone could kill hundreds before the enemy even arrived. But here, nothing like that existed. Lady Vare slowly scratched the side of her head while staring blankly at the organized streets. What? She couldn't help mumbling to herself. She had governed her own territory for years and worked directly under the Queen in managing the kingdom. She understood civilians better than most people present, or at least she thought she did. According to everything she knew, common people simply weren't supposed to behave like this, not after surviving a Supreme's attack, and not after believing they might die only minutes ago. They weren't supposed to become this disciplined, this cooperative, or this obedient. It simply didn't make sense, and it left her completely confused. Lady Vera's eyes slowly moved across the streets before stopping on the B4 soldiers standing around every civilian group. A thought suddenly crossed her mind. Did the soldiers he brought do all this? She continued watching them carefully. The more she observed them, the more unbelievable the scene became. They stood with frightening discipline, looking more like an elite operational force than ordinary soldiers. She had never seen soldiers carry themselves like this before. Not even the royal castle guards, who were among the highest trained soldiers in the entire kingdom, possessed such terrifying discipline. There wasn't a single unnecessary movement among them. Nobody spoke, and nobody looked distracted. Every pair of eyes continuously observed the surroundings while remaining at their assigned positions. It almost felt as though they were all connected by one mind. Just from the organized state of the city alone, she could already guess these soldiers had taken over administration after the attack. But how? That was the part she simply couldn't understand. Restoring order inside a city after such a catastrophe wasn't something that could be accomplished by strength alone. Panic spread faster than fire. Fear destroyed reason, and people became irrational. Yet somehow, these soldiers had stabilized the entire city within such a short period, despite the overwhelming chaos. She honestly couldn't comprehend it. She was still trying to understand when movement caught everyone's attention. A woman wearing the same black military uniform calmly walked toward them from one of the nearby streets. Every eye instinctively shifted toward her. She marched forward with perfect mechanical precision, every step measured to the exact same distance, and every movement executed with flawless synchronization. Her posture remained perfectly straight from beginning to end. Her gaze never wandered, and even the rhythm of her footsteps remained identical with every step. Watching her felt strange. It didn't look like a normal person walking. She stopped exactly one pace before Razeal. Without wasting even a fraction of a second, her right hand rose sharply into a flawless military salute. Commander. Her expression remained completely unchanged. Eyes forward, chin level, and her voice calm, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. B4 Command Unit reporting. Temporary command authority was assumed by me due to the absence of high-ranking command personnel. All operational directives have been executed according to your standing orders. She paused for exactly 1 second, before continuing with the same perfectly measured tone. Objective 1: secure the city. Status complete. The city is currently under 100% surveillance coverage. All major districts, transportation routes, strategic facilities, and civilian shelters remain under continuous observation. The civilian population has been gathered into temporary assessed safe zones. Food distribution established, water distribution established, medical assistance established, security established, and civilian discipline maintained without incident. Medical response units have provided treatment to all recoverable injured civilians. She paused again for precisely the same amount of time, before beginning the next report, without changing even the slightest inflection in her voice. Counterintelligence operation complete. Hostile infiltration was detected during stabilization procedures. 296 unidentified enemy agents have been captured. Confirmed activities include sabotage of infrastructure, destruction of strategic facilities, spreading organized panic among civilians, attacks against non-combatants, elimination of witnesses, intelligence gathering, and attempts to collapse public order from within. All hostile elements detained. Another perfectly timed pause followed before she continued as though simply reading another line of data. Civilian criminal activity was also identified during emergency conditions. 3,589 civilians attempted to exploit the ongoing disaster. Confirmed criminal activities include robbery, assault, murder, kidnapping, sexual violence, unlawful seizure of supplies, and attacks against fellow civilians. 2,467 individuals have been classified as medium-level offenders. 321 individuals have been classified as serious felony offenders. The remaining offenders have been classified under capital crime status, eligible for life imprisonment, or execution under military emergency law. All offenders have been separated according to threat level and placed under armed surveillance. All injured civilians have received medical assistance where recovery was determined to be possible. Confirmed civilian fatalities, 10,683. Primary causes of death: hostile attacks prior to deployment, structural collapse, severe physical trauma, falls, debris impact, crush injuries, and blood loss. Survival probability for unrecovered victims is statistically insignificant. The female commander delivered every sentence in exactly the same perfectly measured tone. There wasn't the slightest pause caused by emotion, no sadness while reporting the dead, no anger while speaking about criminals, and no pride while reporting success. Her voice remained calm, level, and mechanical from beginning to end, like an advanced artificial intelligence reading operational data, rather than a person giving a battlefield report. Once she finished, silence spread across the surroundings. She remained standing exactly where she was. Not a single muscle moved, and even her breathing appeared perfectly controlled. She looked less like a human waiting for an answer, and more like an intelligent machine, remaining in standby mode after completing a task. Then, after allowing precisely enough time for the report to settle, she spoke once more in the same unwavering voice. City secured. Civilian population stabilized under required discipline. Hostile activity neutralized. Awaiting your next command, Commander. Only then did she lower her salute in one smooth motion, before placing both hands naturally by her sides again. Her posture never relaxed. Her eyes remained fixed ahead, patiently awaiting further instructions. Every movement reflected absolute obedience, absolute discipline, and absolute efficiency, as though receiving and executing orders was the sole purpose for which she had been created. The entire street became strangely quiet. Nobody spoke, and nobody even seemed to know how they were supposed to react. Maria stared at the woman with slightly widened eyes. Sofia looked between the commander and Razeal again and again, unable to hide the curiosity growing inside her. Nancy simply stood there silently, her expression becoming more and more complicated the longer she watched. Lady Vera looked completely dumbfounded. The three lords exchanged brief glances before looking back at the commander again. Even the queen herself couldn't hide the amazement in her eyes anymore. None of them had ever witnessed military discipline like this before. It wasn't simply the efficiency that shocked them, it was the professionalism. Every report had been perfectly structured, every operation categorized, and every objective completed with terrifying precision. The woman sounded nothing like a commander from their world. She sounded like the command core of an unimaginably advanced civilization. Everything about her felt too competent, too organized, and too perfect. For the first time in their lives, they understood what true operational efficiency looked like, and it honestly made the military systems they had relied on for generations feel primitive by comparison. Even Razeal remained silent for nearly 2 full seconds. His crimson eyes stayed on the commander, before slowly shifting toward the organized streets behind her. Groups of civilians sat quietly inside designated safe zones. Soldiers maintained order without raising their voices. Medical teams continued treating the wounded. Supply stations were already functioning. Patrol units constantly moved between sectors with flawless coordination. Seeing the entire city operating so smoothly honestly exceeded even his own expectations. He had expected the B4 units to perform efficiently. That was obvious, but not to this extent. Even he found himself genuinely impressed. A faint look of satisfaction appeared in his eyes before he gave a small nod. Good, he said. It was only one word, yet it carried clear approval. His gaze returned to the commander. Good job. The commander didn't smile, she didn't thank him, and she didn't react emotionally in the slightest. She simply gave one precise nod. Acknowledged. That was all. Recognition received. Mission completed. No further response required. Razeal quietly thought for a few moments before giving his next order. Gather every dead body in the city and bring them to the central plaza. His voice remained calm as always. Make sure nobody is left behind, and the more complete the body, the better. The commander immediately responded without needing a second to process the command. Understood. She raised 2 fingers toward the communication device beside her ear. A faint mechanical click echoed before she transmitted the order across the entire B4 network. No further explanation was needed. Every unit would already understand its assignment. Sofia, however, wasn't looking at the commander anymore. Her attention slowly shifted back toward Razeal. She had been fascinated by the strange woman only moments ago, but now a completely different thought had entered her mind. She frowned slightly before looking at him with genuine curiosity. What do you need all those dead bodies for? She asked quietly. Razeal didn't even bother turning toward her. For the obvious reasons, he answered calmly, as though the answer required no explanation whatsoever. Sofia blinked. She remained silent for several long seconds. Then, as realization slowly dawned on her face, her beautiful blue eyes widened little by little. Her breathing unconsciously slowed. Wait, she whispered almost to herself. You can do that to that many people? There was genuine disbelief in her voice. She wasn't asking casually anymore. She had already guessed exactly what he intended to do. Behind her, Maria's eyes widened almost at the same moment. She had reached the same conclusion. Both of them realized the same possibility. Razeal, however, offered no answer. He simply continued looking ahead toward the city in complete silence, his expression remaining calm and unreadable, leaving everyone standing behind him alone with the impossible thought now filling their minds. Chapter 491. It took barely 10 minutes before the entire main road stretching through Silver City had been completely cleared. The efficiency of the B4 units was almost frightening to witness. Hundreds of B4 soldiers moved with perfect coordination, not wasting a single movement. Fallen stone, shattered wood, broken wagons, scattered weapons, and every piece of rubble that blocked the road disappeared one after another, as if the destruction itself was being erased. Some worked separately without ever getting in each other's way. Some cleared debris, some secured buildings that looked ready to collapse, while others carefully carried bodies from every street, alley, rooftop, and ruined home they could reach. There were no shouted orders, no confusion, no panic. Everything happened with complete discipline, as though every soldier already knew exactly what every other soldier was doing. They acted as if they were absolute professionals at everything. The civilians were quietly instructed to stand along both sides of the road. Nobody was pushed roughly or threatened unnecessarily. The soldiers simply pointed where they were to stand, and somehow almost everyone obeyed. The calmness of the soldiers itself forced obedience. Their expressions never changed. Their eyes remained cold and focused, constantly scanning their surroundings. They neither comforted nor argued with anyone. They simply performed their duty. Slowly, one after another, the bodies of the dead were brought forward and laid carefully upon the cleared road. Every corpse was placed respectfully in long, perfectly straight rows. No body was thrown aside carelessly. Every movement was efficient yet strangely dignified, as though even death deserved order. The civilians watched everything unfold in complete confusion. At first, many couldn't understand why every dead body in the city was being gathered into one place. Curious whispers spread through the crowd as people stretched their necks to look farther ahead. Then curiosity slowly turned into something much heavier. Some recognized familiar faces among the growing rows of corpses. An old woman suddenly covered her mouth before breaking into tears after spotting her grandson lying motionless beneath a torn blanket. A little boy screamed and tried running toward the body of his father before two soldiers calmly stepped into his path, gently stopping him without saying a single unnecessary word. A young wife collapsed onto her knees the moment she recognized her husband, crying so hard that even those around her lowered their heads. Others simply stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. Some silently whispered prayers, some closed their eyes, others stared without blinking, refusing to accept the truth before them. The air grew heavier with every passing minute. A few desperate family members tried pushing through the lines, wanting only one last look at those they had lost. Some wanted to hold a hand one final time. Others wanted to see whether their loved ones were truly gone. Yet every attempt was calmly stopped by the soldiers maintaining the perimeter. They never raised their voices. They never struck anyone. A simple raised hand, a firm gesture, or one emotionless look from beneath their helmets was enough. There was something unsettling about them. They carried themselves with such absolute discipline that even the most grief-stricken civilians instinctively stepped back. It wasn't fear born from cruelty. It was the feeling that these soldiers simply could not be moved by emotion while carrying out their orders. Their eyes were empty of hesitation, filled only with the duty of command. The presence of the kingdom's highest nobles helped maintain what little order remained. Lord Draven stood silently with his hands behind his back, his weathered face darker than usual. Lord Carvec remained beside him, jaw tightly clenched as his eyes swept across the endless rows of the dead. Lady Vera stood with folded arms, unusually quiet, her earlier confidence completely absent. Beside them stood Queen Grace herself. Every civilian noticed them. Even in grief, commoners understood the difference between themselves and the nobility. They lowered their voices. Those who had nearly lost control gradually composed themselves. No matter how desperate the situation became, generations of habit taught them not to create chaos before the rulers of the kingdom. Several more minutes passed before the last body was finally brought forward. The soldiers stepped back in perfect formation, leaving behind a sight so horrifying that silence itself seemed to descend over the city. Long rows of corpses stretched as far as the eye could see. Some bodies were almost peaceful, as though asleep. Others had been crushed beneath collapsing buildings. Some were missing limbs. Some had deep wounds carved across their chests. Others were barely recognizable beneath dried blood, ash, and dust. Torn clothing fluttered gently in the wind. The smell of blood mixed with smoke hung heavily over the road. A few civilians could no longer bear the sight, and turned away, covering their mouths. Others buried their faces into the shoulders of family members. Many openly wept. The entire city felt as though it had forgotten how to breathe. Queen Grace slowly lowered her eyes. Her lips pressed together so tightly they almost turned white. The sorrow on her face was impossible to hide. These weren't merely citizens to her, they were her people. Every corpse lying before her felt like a failure she could never erase. As queen, she had sworn to protect this kingdom, yet today thousands lay dead beneath the open sky. A painful thought quietly settled inside her heart. If only she had been stronger. If only she had possessed even a fraction of the strength her father once held. Perhaps so many innocent lives would still be alive today. The weight of that thought settled upon her shoulders like iron. The three lords lowered their heads slightly. Even the soldiers of Denver Kingdom standing nearby could no longer maintain their relieved expressions about the war being over. Shame mixed with grief filled every face now. No victory could erase what had been lost today. The war had ended, but the price of that war still lay before them in silence. The entire atmosphere became unbearably heavy. It wasn't simply sadness anymore. It was mourning shared by an entire kingdom. Then suddenly Razeal stepped forward. His footsteps were calm, yet somehow every eye naturally turned toward him. He stopped before the countless rows of the dead and quietly looked over them for several long seconds. His crimson eyes reflected nothing that anyone could understand. When he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent road. "This," he said calmly, "will be the first greeting from your new king." Confusion immediately spread through the crowd. Nobody understood what he meant. Before anyone could ask, Razeal calmly raised his right hand toward his mouth. Without hesitation, he bit deeply into his own palm. Dark crimson blood immediately flowed from the wound, dripping between his fingers before running down his wrist. He didn't even flinch. His expression never changed. Then, with one smooth motion, he swung his bleeding hand through the air. The blood scattered outward. Hundreds, no, Thousands of tiny crimson droplets spread across the sky like countless shining rubies caught beneath the afternoon sunlight. Instead of falling to the ground, every single drop suddenly stopped in midair. The entire road fell into absolute silence. The floating droplets glimmered quietly above the corpses. Nobody understood what they were witnessing. Everyone standing behind him frowned deeply in confusion. The civilians watched with confusion as well. Then, suddenly under Razeal's control, every single droplet moved. Without warning, the floating blood shot forward in thousands of different directions. The crimson streaks crossed through the air like countless tiny comets. Each drop found a body. Some struck gently against the forehead of the dead. Others entered through broken skulls where no forehead remained. Some disappeared into shattered chests. Others entered bodies so mangled they were barely human anymore. The dark crimson blood sank quietly into every corpse. Then it vanished, as though the bodies themselves had absorbed it. The moment that happened, he activated the true ability that he had gained after his killing Dao reached S rank. True Killing Revival. A terrifying ability that granted him the power to return to life anyone who had died within the last 24 hours. -1 killing point. -1 killing point. -1 killing point. The familiar notifications immediately began echoing inside his mind one after another. Ding, ding, ding. They continued without pause as thousands of lives were selected by the skill. With every notification, another killing point disappeared. Razeal quietly felt the power inside his killing Dao being consumed bit by bit. It wasn't a painful feeling. It simply felt as though a tiny portion of the endless killing intent he carried was being drawn away to fuel the skill. Under normal circumstances, such consumption might have been noticeable, but compared to the unimaginable amount of killing points he possessed after everything he had experienced, the decrease was almost meaningless. If he hadn't been paying attention to the process itself, he probably wouldn't have even realized the points were disappearing. Even so, he calmly continued the activation without the slightest hesitation. Then the skill finally began taking effect. The change was so sudden that every person watching unconsciously stopped breathing. The countless corpses lying silently across the road suddenly trembled. At first it was only a faint movement. A finger twitched. A shoulder jerked slightly. A foot shifted almost invisibly. Then every body that had absorbed Razeal's blood began radiating an extremely faint glow. It wasn't bright. It wasn't holy. It wasn't dark either. It was simply life. A thin, strange vitality slowly spread through every corpse like water flowing through dry earth. The lifeless bodies that had only moments ago been cold and empty suddenly began recovering right before everyone's eyes. Broken bones slowly moved back into place. Deep cuts started closing. Blood stopped flowing. Torn flesh began reconnecting itself. Crushed muscles slowly rebuilt themselves. Where arms had been torn away, new flesh slowly began growing. Where legs had been lost, bones stretched outward before muscles, veins, and skin rapidly formed around it. Even shattered faces slowly reconstructed themselves piece by piece until they returned to their original appearance. The process wasn't instant, but it was happening, right before everyone's eyes. Slow enough for every single person present to witness death itself being undone. A heavy silence swept across the road. Then fear followed. The civilians instinctively took several steps backward. Many covered their mouths. Some grabbed their children tightly. Others stared with faces completely drained of color. Nobody understood what they were witnessing. Even Maria and Sofia unconsciously took 2 quick steps forward instead of backward. Unlike the others, both of them had already guessed what Razeal intended to do when he ordered every corpse to be gathered together. But guessing and actually witnessing were 2 completely different things. Their beautiful eyes widened to their limits. Both slowly turned toward Razeal. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them could. Shock completely filled their faces, even after everything they had already witnessed him accomplish today. This still shattered every expectation they had. Behind them, Lord Draven slowly clenched his fists. Lord Carvec completely forgot to breathe. Queen Grace stared ahead without blinking. Lady Vera looked as though the world itself had stopped making sense. Nancy silently covered her lips. The soldiers of Denver Kingdom looked between the corpses and Razeal again and again, completely unable to process what they were seeing. Some people initially thought he was performing some dark ritual upon the dead. Some even believed he was violating the bodies for some unknown experiment. But before those thoughts could fully settle, the impossible happened. One corpse opened its eyes, then another, then dozens, then hundreds, then thousands until all, one after another, the dead slowly inhaled their first breath. Some suddenly sat upright in confusion. Others pushed themselves onto trembling arms before looking around blankly. Many stared at their own hands. Some instinctively touched their chests where fatal wounds had existed only moments earlier. Others looked down at missing limbs that had somehow returned. Every single revived person wore the same confused expression. The last thing they remembered was dying. The scene became even more terrifying than before. Thousands of people were literally rising from death together. The entire road suddenly erupted into complete chaos. What is happening? They're moving. The dead are alive. They came back. Cries of disbelief spread everywhere. Some civilians screamed and stumbled backward in fear. Others fell onto the ground. A few started crying even harder than before. Some people dropped to their knees, believing they were witnessing some miracle sent by the gods or something. Others genuinely thought ghosts had returned to haunt the city. Parents tightly hugged their children. Children buried their faces into their mother's clothes. Several old men began praying with trembling voices. The soldiers maintaining order remained at their positions, though even a few of them couldn't completely hide the astonishment in their eyes. The revived people themselves were no less frightened. One middle-aged man slowly looked down at his own hands. His fingers trembled. He remembered. He clearly remembered a massive stone crushing his body. He remembered the unbearable pain. He remembered darkness swallowing everything. Yet now, he felt no pain. Slowly, he touched his own chest. No wound. He looked at his blood-soaked clothes. The dried blood was still there. The torn fabric remained. Everything proved he had died. Wasn't. His voice shook. Wasn't I dead? Not far away, a young woman frantically touched her own face before grabbing her legs. She remembered both of them being crushed beneath debris. Yet now they moved perfectly. She suddenly burst into tears. Nearby, a little girl who had died beside her mother slowly opened her eyes before seeing the same mother crying, while hugging her tightly. The woman's scream echoed throughout the entire road as she embraced her daughter with both arms, refusing to let go again. Scenes like that began appearing everywhere. Families reunited. Children cried. Parents laughed and sobbed together. Brothers embraced brothers. Husbands held wives they had believed lost forever. The entire city became filled with crying, laughter, disbelief, confusion, prayers, screams, and countless emotions all blending together into one overwhelming sound. Nobody knew whether they should celebrate or fear the person who had made such a thing possible. Lady Vera finally snapped out of her shock. Her breathing had become uneven. Her heartbeat pounded loudly inside her ears. She slowly turned toward Razeal. Her eyes remained impossibly wide. Her lips trembled. For several seconds, no words came out. Finally, you. Her voice almost broke. You. She swallowed hard, still unable to believe what stood before her. What? What did you do? Razeal, though, completely ignored Lady Vera's question. It was as though he hadn't even heard her. His crimson eyes remained fixed ahead as he slowly rose into the air, ascending higher and higher until he floated above the ruined streets of Silver City. There was no burst of mana or dramatic display of power. He simply lifted himself into the sky with effortless calm. It was enough. Every pair of eyes in the city was getting naturally drawn toward him. The countless civilians, soldiers, nobles, and even the thousands who had only moments ago returned from death slowly looked up at the young man standing alone against the gray sky. At that moment, he was impossible to ignore. He had become the center of every gaze in that crowd right now. Below him, Silver City was still drowning in chaos. The streets echoed with cries of relief and disbelief. Some people laughed while tears streamed down their faces. Others held their loved ones so tightly it seemed they were afraid they would disappear again. Many of those who had just been revived simply stood where they were, repeatedly touching their faces, arms, and chests before staring down at their blood-soaked clothes with empty expressions. They remembered dying. They remembered the pain. Yet now they were alive. Their minds simply couldn't understand it. Parents kept checking whether their children were truly breathing. Husbands held wives. Brothers embraced sisters. The entire city was overwhelmed by emotions that words could hardly describe. Razeal quietly looked over the broken capital. His crimson eyes slowly swept across the countless faces staring back at him. He waited just long enough for more people to notice him before finally opening his mouth. Calm yourselves. His voice wasn't loud, yet the moment he spoke it spread throughout the entire city as though carried by the wind itself. Every street, every rooftop, every ruined building echoed with his words in perfect clarity. It reached even those standing far away who couldn't see him clearly. One by one, conversations stopped. The crying slowly quieted. The shouting gradually faded. Thousands of heads turned toward the sky until almost the entire city was looking only at him. This, he said calmly, is my first gift to this kingdom. No one interrupted. I have returned to life every person who died during this unnecessary war. The silence immediately shattered into countless whispers. People instinctively looked toward the loved ones standing beside them. Some covered their mouths. Others lowered themselves onto their knees. Many who had already guessed the truth still couldn't believe it after hearing the words spoken aloud. Razeal simply waited until the whispers settled again before continuing. As for why, there is no special reason. It was simply something that I was able to give. He paused only briefly before continuing. My name is Razeal Vilius. His voice remained calm. I am your new king. I protected this kingdom. I destroyed your enemy. And I safeguarded every life that I could. He spoke without pride, without arrogance, without trying to impress anyone. His expression remained completely indifferent, as though he were simply stating ordinary facts that required no explanation. Yet somehow, that calmness carried even greater weight than any proud declaration could have. For below, Maria quietly stared upward, unable to hide the admiration in her eyes. Sofia stood beside her with a small smile, her ocean blue eyes never leaving him for even a second. Nancy folded her arms silently, while watching him with an expression that had become impossible to read. Queen Grace, Lord Draven, Lord Carvec, Lady Vera, and every noble present simply looked up in silence. None of them felt the need to interrupt. At this moment, the entire city belonged to his voice alone. Razeal slowly looked across the broken streets once more. So, there is no need for panic. The battle is over. The enemy is dead. And you all are safe now. Those words spread through the city like a warm breeze after a violent storm. Many people unconsciously released the breath they had been holding. For the first time since the invasion had begun, they finally believed they had survived. But his voice became serious once more. This city still has suffered severe damage. He slowly looked toward the collapsed buildings, broken homes, burning streets, and shattered walls surrounding every district. Many of your homes no longer exist. Many families have lost everything. That is why my first order as your king is. He spoke each sentence clearly so every citizen could hear. Do not create unnecessary disorder. Remain calm. Follow every instruction given to you by the soldiers stationed throughout the city. They will guide you. They are here to protect you. If your home still stands, return to it immediately, and remain there peacefully. And if your home has been destroyed, temporary camps will be established. You will remain there until further instructions. Food, water, medical treatment, shelter, and every necessity required for your survival will be provided by the city's authorities. Razeal continued without changing his expression. Do not interfere with the soldiers carrying out their duties. They are working to save lives. They are working to restore the city. If you truly wish to help, then cooperate. His crimson eyes slowly swept across the sea of people one final time. Maintain order. At a time like this, discipline will save far more lives than panic ever will. Silence settled over Silver City. A very long and heavy silence. But it was not the silence of celebration. It was the silence of thousands of minds failing to understand what they had just witnessed. No cheers rose from the streets. No applause echoed through the broken city. Instead, people simply stood where they were, staring at the young man floating above them as though they feared that blinking would shatter whatever strange dream they had fallen into. Mothers still held children they had buried only moments before. Husbands kept touching the faces of wives they had watched die. Friends gripped each other's shoulders with trembling hands, whispering the same question over and over again. How? No one had an answer. Some of the people who had returned from death looked down at their own bodies with pale faces, touching healed wounds through blood-soaked clothes. Others looked at the corpses beside them that had not belonged to family, but had also risen again. It was impossible. They all knew it was impossible. Magic could heal. Magic could destroy. Magic could create fire, storms, and mountains of ice. But death was absolute. That was what every child in the world had been taught. Yet today, before the eyes of the entire city, someone had casually reached into that absolute truth and broken it apart. Even those who had heard Razeal introduce himself barely reacted. Some had heard every word. Others had only caught pieces of it. Many were still too overwhelmed to even think about who he was. A few quietly repeated his name under their breath, trying to remember whether they had heard it before. Some whispered that perhaps he was a god. Others immediately denied it, insisting gods did not walk among men. And old priest simply stood frozen, his lips moving soundlessly, as though every prayer he had ever learned had suddenly become meaningless. Not one person stepped forward to question him. Not one dared to interrupt. They were simply confused, deeply, utterly confused. Razeal looked across the city one final time before speaking again, his expression no different from before, as calm as if he were discussing tomorrow's weather instead of addressing tens of thousands of people whose understanding of the world had just collapsed. And one more thing. His voice carried across every street with perfect clarity, causing countless wandering thoughts to halt once more. If anyone attempts to take advantage of this situation, if anyone commits violence, if anyone chooses to rob, assault, murder, or spread disorder while the city is recovering, they will be held accountable. His crimson eyes slowly swept across the ruined capital. The soldiers standing among you have been assigned temporary authority over Silver City. They are responsible for protecting every civilian. They are responsible for maintaining order. Until this city has recovered, the entire capital will remain under emergency administration. So yes, behave yourselves. His words were neither loud nor passionate. They carried no attempt to inspire. He simply spoke as someone issuing practical instructions after a battle had ended. Perhaps that was why people listened. There was no arrogance in his voice, no demand that they praise him, no declaration that they kneel. He simply gave orders that made sense. Again, nobody answered. Queen Grace stood quietly with her hands folded before her thoughts still scattered beyond words. Lord Draven slowly let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Lord Carveck's usually stern face had completely lost its composure. Lady Vera simply stared at Razeal as though seeing him for the first time. Even Maria, Sofia, Nancy, and the others found themselves saying nothing. There simply wasn't anything they could say after witnessing thousands of dead people return to life. Receiving no response, Razeal gave a faint nod. That will be all. He did not wait for approval. He did not wait for gratitude. Without another glance toward the crowd, he slowly descended from the sky until his boots touched the broken stone road with barely a sound. The moment he landed, every pair of eyes nearby shifted toward him. Sofia looked at him quietly. Maria remained unusually silent. Queen Grace and the gathered lords continued watching him, as though trying to understand what kind of man stood before them. Yet Razeal ignored every gaze. Their thoughts were their own concern. He turned toward the temporary commander of the B4 unit. Temporary unit leader. The woman immediately straightened. Commander, contact every active unit. Escort all civilians to designated safe areas. Continue following every instruction I just issued as well. The woman listened without moving a single muscle. Understood. She touched two fingers lightly against the communication device beside her temple. A faint electronic tone sounded. Within seconds, encrypted orders had already been transmitted to every B4 unit operating throughout Silver City. She lowered her hand. Command successfully distributed. Awaiting further orders, Commander. Her expression remained exactly the same. Calm, precise, emotionless. No, that will be all. Understood. She nodded and kept standing there silently. After that, Razeal turned toward Lady Vera. Who is responsible for governing this city? Lady Vera blinked. Ha, ha, it took her several moments to realize he had spoken to her. She still wasn't fully present. Truthfully, almost no one was. Only the B4 units continued functioning normally, their artificial minds untouched by disbelief or emotion. Every human present remained trapped somewhere between astonishment and reality. Resurrection. Real resurrection? Such a thing simply did not belong in this world. Throughout history, there were ancient tales claiming that one or two gods had once returned a single soul to life. Those stories had survived precisely because they were considered miracles beyond mortal reach. Entire religions had been built upon legends far smaller than what had just happened. Yet today, Razeal had restored more than 10,000 lives as though it were simply another spell. How was anyone supposed to process that? Lady Vera finally opened her mouth. The city lord is Her mind wasn't yet processing. Razeal raised one hand, stopping her. No, forget it. Simply deliver my orders to whoever currently governs Silver City. He is to immediately assume responsibility for reconstruction, mobilize every available worker, distribute food, water, medicine, and shelter, repair roads, restore essential buildings, and begin rebuilding the city without delay. He gave the order without any hesitation. Lady Vera almost spoke. The words reached the back of her throat before stopping there. The city lord couldn't possibly handle something on this scale. Half the capital had been reduced to rubble. Roads had collapsed. Entire districts would need to be rebuilt from their foundations. Thousands had lost their homes. Food, medicine, timber, stone, labor, everything would require an enormous amount of resources, far more than the city's treasury could ever provide. That responsibility belonged to the royal treasury. Only the kingdom itself possessed the wealth to recover from a disaster of this size. For a brief moment, she turned her eyes toward Queen Grace. The queen met her gaze immediately. Nothing needed to be said. Grace understood exactly what Vera had been thinking. After a moment, she gave the faintest nod. Obviously, the royal treasury would bear the burden. Vera quietly drew a slow breath before looking back at Razeal. Very well. Your orders will be delivered. There was no point arguing over finances now. Whether Razeal had spoken those orders or not, rebuilding the city had always been their first responsibility once the battle ended. The work simply could not be avoided. Silver City was the border of the kingdom. Leaving it in ruins was never an option. The cost? They would worry about the cost later. One problem at a time. Her eyes drifted toward the countless people still gathered throughout the streets. Many had finally begun moving under the guidance of the B4 soldiers. Some were helping elderly family members walk. Others carried frightened children in their arms. Though confusion still filled every face, panic had noticeably begun to fade. Order, however fragile, was slowly returning. Her gaze unconsciously returned to Razeal. Not once, not a single person standing here had asked him how he had done it. Not Queen Grace, not the lords, not Sofia, not Maria, not even Nancy. It wasn't because they weren't curious. If anything, every one of them wanted an answer more than anything else. But some questions simply weren't asked, not when the question is too big to be questioned. Resurrection. True resurrection. That wasn't merely another powerful spell. It was something kingdoms would wage wars over, religions would collapse for, and even emperors would kill for. Every person present understood that much. If Razeal wished to explain it, he would. If he did not, no one intended to force the question. Some secrets were better left untouched. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Vera slowly looked away before turning toward one of the assembled nobles. Her eyes settled upon Lord Karvek. She gave him a small, meaningful nod. Nothing more. It was enough. Karvek understood immediately. He stepped forward and inclined his head respectfully. I will inform the city lord at once. His voice was calm, though the events of the day had clearly left their mark. Even now, part of him still struggled to believe everything he had witnessed. He turned toward Razeal. After a brief pause, he lowered his head once. My king. The words came naturally this time, not out of blind loyalty, nor fear, simply because, after today, denying reality served no purpose. Whether the kingdom accepted it today, or months from now, everything had already changed. Razeal merely looked at him for a moment before giving a slight nod. He neither thanked him nor offered further instructions. There was no need. Karvek understood. Without wasting another moment, he leaped into the air, Aura gathering beneath his feet before carrying him across the ruined skyline toward the center of Silver City, where the city lord and the remaining administrative officials would undoubtedly already be trying to make sense of the catastrophe that had unfolded. His figure disappeared between the damaged towers within moments. Silence lingered behind him once more, not the uncomfortable silence from before, but the quiet that followed when everyone already knew what had to be done. The battle was over. Now the work began. To be continued. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an update. Check out the playlist to catch up on the rest of the series. I'll be back with the next part soon. Stay tuned.